What is the most budget NA+T build you could possibly do? All I've done is created a list of what parts do you absolutely need to do an NA+T. Let's start with the fuel system, because there's no point spending lots of money on turbos and other cool go-fast bits if your car runs leaner than your bank account 2 days after payday. Because we are on a budget, we're going to stick with the NA fuel rail and intake. If we want to change the rail or the intake, we have to change both to turbo or some kind of aftermarket setup. So to save money, we're going to stick with the plastic intake and the NA fuel rail. Now, there is actually drop-in fuel pressure regulators for the NA fuel rail on the market now. These 4-bar regulators will help you get your fuel pressure up high enough to be able to match factory turbo standards. Next up, let's talk about injectors. Now, the NA and the turbo injectors are actually different lengths. They won't fit in each other's fuel rails, so it's not like you can just go to a car meet, find a factory turbo with its bonnet up and nick their injectors. You're gonna have to buy your own. When you do, make sure that they are the correct length for the NA fuel rail or have adapters so that they'll fit. You can pick up a set of 627cc Bosch injectors for about $500. These will be good if you're not running any ethanol and you're only seeking a few pounds of boost. For spark plugs, just get some NGK BKR7Es. I use them in both my turbo and my NA Falcons, and they run like a dream in both. Then finally, the fuel pump. Now, if our objective is to just put a turbo on and make a little bit of boost, we don't need to go too crazy here. We can save some money. Something like the Walbro 255 is only about $120. They're relatively easy to fit, only requires a little bit of modifying the hanger for the fuel pump, and they should provide more than enough fuel for this application. Could you use a 460 instead? Absolutely. But remember, we're talking about a really budget build here. We're trying to save every dollar possible. And something like a 460 is probably going to be way over the top for this application. Having said that, if there was anywhere that you were going to spend more money on a turbo build, it would be the fuel system. I mean, there's no point having the most expensive high-performance turbo in the world if you can never run it more than 50% duty cycle because your fuel system is too insufficient to be able to provide enough fuel when there's all that extra air being crammed into the engine. In my own experience, it's maddening having to spend money all over again on upgrading every bottleneck within the fuel system to provide enough fuel to help the car achieve its actual maximum potential. So if you want to get a bigger fuel pump, bigger injectors, bigger fuel pressure regulator, all that sort of stuff, I would say it's worth it. Next, let's talk about valve springs. Now, we are doing a budget build, trying to save as much money as possible. And sure, if you look at certain NA+T groups on Facebook, there's plenty of people running factory valve springs with 10, 15 pounds, and they don't seem to have any valve float. But I would say that this is probably one of those things where, sure, there might be a few people who are getting away with it, but anyone who's not getting away with it probably isn't posting about it and bragging about their valve springs failing. So this is one of those things where I think you absolutely do need to be spending the money to get them and change them, despite some people getting away with factory ones for an indeterminate amount of time. There is, of course, a lot of different options for valve springs in Barras these days, ranging from no-name all the way up to big, well-known, expensive brands. I'm gonna try and just average it out and say, let's make it about $500 just for the valve springs for the entire engine. Now, keep in mind, unless you have the tool and you're confident that you can change the valve springs yourself, this is probably going to be one of those things where you will have to get somebody else's layer involved. And so there would be the added cost of getting those valve springs done. I've heard people paying about $1,000 to get valve springs in their Barra done if they're able to provide the car to the shop or to the person who is doing that. So keep that in mind as a bit of an extra expense around valve springs if you don't buy the tool and have the capability of changing those valve springs yourself. Next up is turbo oil and water feed and return lines. Now, you could basically just do what I did and go with the factory setup. The guys at Elite Performance and Tuning drilled my sump for the oil return. They tapped the thermostat housing in the factory location for the water feed. And as a result, I basically just have a completely factory setup. But if you're not quite confident in that, there's a few different options you could go with for an NA+T. For example, if you're not confident tapping the thermostat housing for your water, you could change the upper part of that housing with this little aeroflow piece, and then you can just throw some lines on that little barb, run it into your turbo, and there you go. It's not going to be as good as using the factory setup, but it's certainly an option that will at least work. Both Custom Alloy Welding and Barra the World have their own kits for water feed and return lines for NA+Ts. They range from about $350 to $400, and each has their own advantages or disadvantages depending how comfortable you are with the setup and installation of said kit. I will say, however, that both of them are far better options than changing the upper thermostat housing and using that as your option for a water feed line. Both of these kits will provide far more consistent high pressure water flow than doing that upper thermostat housing option may be. So even though we're talking about a budget build here, and that upper thermostat housing option would be cheaper, I would say go with one of these kits or the factory setup like I have with mine, because that's going to be a lot safer and a lot smarter for the long-term health of your turbo and the entire build actually working. But what about the oil feed and return lines? Well, the good news is that the NA and the turbo barras both use the same block. All you've got to do is unscrew the oil pressure sensor, throw in some fittings, and then you can buy basically any off-the-shelf aftermarket oil feed kits, run that straight in. For the return line, you're going to have no choice but to drill your sump. It's just about whether you try and recreate the factory fittings or you just drill a hole, tap it, and then get some aftermarket AN fittings and hook that up. The good news is that there are a few kits out there online for aftermarket fittings for the return line, and they only cost about $150. The power steering cooler is going to be our next problem. The NA one sits right where we want to put our intercooler, and unfortunately, the NA cooler's hard lines are too short to be able to move it up into the location where it would sit in a factory XR6 turbo. That basically leaves us with three options. One would be to move the cooler somewhere else, but because it's all hard lines and it's a big, long, weird thing because it normally sits where the radiator is, it's really inconvenient, and you always kind of end up shoving it up underneath where it's probably going to get smashed apart on the very first gutter or speed bump that you hit. The second option is what I ended up doing, which was just replace it completely with an aftermarket cooler. This means that you can get it into a more convenient location and probably swap it out with a much smaller but still effective cooler. Or the third option, delete it completely. And whilst this is a budget build and deleting the cooler completely and not having to spend money on an aftermarket one would save you more money, in the long run it's going to cost you more, because everyone who deletes the power steering cooler ends up breaking their power steering. So just go ahead, get yourself an aftermarket cooler, put it in a more convenient location, and that only has to set you back about $70 to $100. Finally, it's time to start talking about the fun stuff. Turbocharger. Now, you can get yourself a Pulsar 3582 or a 76, whatever you want, for about $1,000, maybe even less. But because this is a budget build, let's go even further. eBay no brand, only $650. Or if you're willing to compromise on the AR a little bit, you can go as low as $180 for a 3582 off of eBay. Remember, we're not trying to make big horsepower here or be super efficient. We're just trying to make cool turbo noises, a little bit more power, and put a smile on your face. The exhaust manifold is going to be a little bit more challenging. There are a couple of options for aftermarket, but they all pretty much cost the same price, come from the same factory as far as I'm aware. But as I mentioned at the start, you can save a lot here if you just want to buy a factory one off of Marketplace or eBay. Also, don't forget to get yourself a new gasket and bolts for that exhaust manifold. The bolts are different lengths, so you're gonna need new bolts for that. The gasket, I don't know why you're trying to reuse the old gasket. We're doing a budget build here, not an exhaust leak build. Exhaust is also gonna be a little bit difficult for this build list because, again, I'm not counting anything secondhand. It would be cheapest to just buy an entire exhaust setup secondhand. You're probably going to be able to pick it up at the fraction of the cost of buying brand new. But because we are only talking about brand new off-the-shelf stuff, let's just do an entire dump, cat, and exhaust. That's going to set you back $1,600, which probably constitutes the biggest expense in this entire build all on its own. I think by the end, when we tally this all up, this actually makes such a measurable portion of the build. It costs more than a whole bunch of stuff all put together. The turbo intake. This is also going to be a little bit difficult because we're not spending any money on a turbo set intake and a battery relocation because this is a budget build. You could use the factory intercooler piping and the crossover pipe and all that sort of stuff, but that's really ugly. So I'm going to say, let's just get a cheap pod filter, shove it on the turbo. It's not legal, but neither is turbocharging your NA Falcon when you're on your Ps. But that is why you're watching this video, isn't it, Damien? Yeah, I know what you're doing, mister. Criminal. But what about the cold side and intercooler and piping? Well, the good news is that the intake plenum is going to be more than enough to handle the amount of boost we're talking about with this setup. So no money spent there. There's countless options on the market for intercoolers and piping. You could get a specifically NA+T kit for about $800, but that's not budget enough for me. So let's go back to eBay and get even more budget. For about $300 each, you can get yourself an intercooler and piping. Then all it takes is a silicon elbow bend for about $40, and you've got your intercooler and piping all hooked up. Blow-off valve isn't on this list because it's not absolutely necessary, and this is an ultra budget NA+T build. So door stopper on and enjoy the cool and call it a day. Although personally, I would get at least a factory elbow and blow-off valve and put them on. There are a bunch of options for aftermarket elbows and blow-off valves that you can go with. Some of them quite cheap, but if we're talking ultra budget, no blow-off valve. Now let's talk about the map sensor. If you've got an FG, you'll have to use a B series turbo map sensor. And if you've got a B series, you'll have to use an FG turbo series map sensor. Why they changed them around? I don't know. It was probably just to screw with people. If you really wanted to, you could de-pin the plugs and then replace them, but that would require some messing around on the ECU side of things so that it understands what it's looking at. And it only costs about $40 for a Bosch map sensor. So just get whichever one is applicable for your application. Finally, let's talk about the boost controller. How will you control the boost for your NA+T? Because your factory ECU can't do it. I know that this is a budget build, and we've talked about doing some things or cutting out some things that normally most people would not be comfortable with doing. But please, for the love of God, do not under any circumstances use a boost T in your NA+T build. This ancient, decrepit technology should never find its way anywhere near any car in the modern day. Just get yourself a proper electronic boost controller. I use the GFB GeForce 3. It has proper electronic boost control and only costs about $400. With our list complete, we can add it all together and find the total cost of our budget NA+T build. And it's about $5,000. That's it. $5,000 in parts is all it will take to turbocharge an NA Falcon. Now, of course, that doesn't include the tuning. Tuning will set you back another $1,000 to $2,000, so that's about $7,000 all up. So long as you're willing to do most of the work, bolting stuff on at home yourself, you can save so much money on an NA+T build. And frankly, all this stuff is really, really basic. You can fit factory intercooler piping, you can fit intercoolers and unbolt manifolds and put new manifolds on at home yourself so easily. So many people are already doing it and saving the insane amount of money on labor to pay someone else to do it. It comes back to the whole thing of built, not bought. Why are you paying somebody else to do all this work that you could do yourself? And people who say, well, I'm going to pay someone else to do it right and all that sort of stuff, it kind of, to me, just comes down to a type of elitism. I've got more money than you and therefore I'm better because I'm willing to just spend more money than you are, even though I don't really have to. It's mostly because I'm too lazy or too scared to work on my own car myself. Now, of course, you can make the argument that a factory XR6 Turbo is going to be better and have better future power making and reliability prospects than a budget NA+T build like this. But to that, I would say, yeah, no shit. Nobody who's doing a budget NA+T build is going into it thinking that they're going to end up with something better than a factory XR6 Turbo or a built XR6 Turbo. That's just not what this is about. This is about doing something that's fun on a budget and being able to do it at a fraction of the cost of what it would be to go out and buy a secondhand, already well and truly flogged factory XR6 Turbo. At the end of the day, the math just doesn't check out. If you want to build a budget NA+T, this list of parts will easily get you this entire build done for about $5,000, maybe a little bit more depending how much you have to pay someone else to do some stuff for you. And if you want to push things more extreme and make more power, all you need to do is make adjustments to some of the parts used here to allow for better power making capability. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, if this list was useful to you, or if you disagree with anything, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.